Now I'm going to provide an overview of the checkout controller, more like what happens when we want to buy a course and we hit the checkout page. So I clicked on it and here is the checkout page. So when we hit the checkout page, you see that the URL is checkout/German intermediate course. So this is the slug of our course or of the course that we want to buy. So we are hitting this route. So let's see what controller picks up the route, and it should be this route. So the checkout controller is going to pick up the request. You see checkout/course slug, and we have to look at the index method of the checkout controller. And as you see, we are using a middleware, the auth middleware here, which means that if the user is not logged in, then the user cannot access this checkout page. Let's go to the checkout controller then. And here we are in the index method and we get the course slug from the URL. So first, we are getting the course based on this course slug. And if there is no course, so if we could not fetch the course from the database, then we are going to abort with a 403 message. Notice that here I'm using the so-called DB facade or the DB class in Laravel to get the course based on the slug from the URL. And the reason I'm not using the eloquent model is that the DB class should be a bit faster than saying course equals course where slug blah blah blah. And whenever I just want to quickly fetch a resource, I'm using the DB facade or class in Laravel. However, if I want to fetch a resource and then update it, then eloquent is the way to go. We are also saving the authenticated user into this auth user variable. Now notice that we had the middleware on our route, the auth route. So if we are here, so if we hit this line in the code, then for sure we should have an authenticated user. And I'm not going to check if there is one, and I'm not going to abort if there is none. However, if we want to be super safe, we could have another check here, similar as to the check-in of the course. Now the next line is interesting. So I'm saving something into this user course variable. And what I want to know is that in this user courses table, if there is a row where the user ID is the ID of the authenticated user, and where the course ID is the ID of the course that is to be bought. And if this variable is not null, then it means that the user who wants to buy this course already has access to this course. And we really don't want the user to buy the same course again, so we are aborting with a 403 message saying you already have access to this course. However, there is another check. So if the user has access to the course based on the user courses table, and the user is not an admin, so if the role ID is not 1 but 2, and 2 should be the role ID for the member, so if the member has access to the course and the member is not an admin, then we will abort. However, if the user has access to the course, but the user is an admin, and actually I'm logged in as an admin now, as you can see based on the header, then I don't want to abort because I'm just testing if I can buy the course or not. So, you know, as an admin, I just wanted in this demo application to have the opportunity to do many tests without migrating the database all the time. So this is why this check is here. In short, an admin can buy a course as many times as they want because they are testing the application. Let's move on to this line of code. So in the countries variable, we are saving the countries, and I'm using eloquent here because I also save the states in order in the with the countries, and I'm ordering the countries themselves by name in an ascending fashion, and I'm getting all the countries. So let's check the country model here, and we will see what this relationship defines. So country.php. So we have one relationship defined, states in order. So we are getting the states for the countries, and on the states table we should have a country code column, and this country code column should match the code column on our courses table. And we're also ordering the states by state name in an ascending fashion. So I'm getting the countries. I'm loading the states in ascending orders for each country, and I'm ordering the countries in ascending fashion as well. I'm saving the email of the authenticated user in this variable, and then I'm getting the settings, more like the first row from the settings table. This table should only have one row all the time. And if there are no settings, which should never happen, then we are going to abort. Now these settings are obviously these payment settings that we looked at earlier. So these are the settings that we need for the checkout. Let's get back to the checkout controller. I'm saving the currency text, in this currency text raw variable. So it should be USD here. So I'm saving the string USD here. And then I'm getting the currency with the help of the currency helper class. And I define the getCurrency string method. We will take a look into this now. I will search for this. Oh, it's actually already open. Good. And we have this getCurrency string method. I'm getting the settings here as well. And then I'm saving the currency into a currency text variable. Now it should be USD for now. I will put a comment here that this is what the currency text variable should hold for now when we hit this line of code. And then I have an adjusted currency text variable, and I'm just concatenating a space to USD. So now we have USD and the space here in this adjusted currency text variable. If we don't want to use a currency symbol, which is this setting, so if we don't want to use a currency symbol, I'm just returning USD with a space. However, if we want to use a currency symbol and the chosen currency, so this currency text variable, is either USD, Euro, or British pounds, then I'm getting the currency, so I'm getting USD. In our example now, I'm getting USD from the currencies table. Okay, I just get the row with USD. And if it is not null, so if there is indeed a row that contains USD, then I'm going to get the symbol from that row. So let's check our database. We have a currencies table. And we have USD here. And you see that in the symbol column, we have the USD symbol here. So in the adjusted currency text variable, we are simply saving the USD symbol, and we will not return this USD with a space. Let's go back to the checkout. So I'm just going to my dashboard, courses, German Intermediate, and I want to buy it. And as you can see, the currency symbol is used. Now I will change the settings. So payment settings, currency is USD. However, I don't want to use the currency symbol. I'm going to update settings. And now I'm just refreshing the same checkout. And as you can see, we have now USD with a space. So if no currency symbol is used, then I want to put a space between the currency string and the number. However, if a symbol is used, then I think it looks much nicer if we have the currency symbol and right next to it we have the price of the product. I'm just going to redo this. I like the currency symbol more. Okay, it looks very good. Let's get back to the checkout controller. All right, we were here. So in this currency variable, we will have the USD symbol saved for now. And now in this Braintree enabled variable, we are saving the Boolean if Braintree is enabled or not. So if it is enabled, it will be 1. If not enabled, it will be 0. And based on the database, we see that the Braintree is indeed enabled. enable Braintree is A1. Good, this is what we want to see. Now we will do the same with Stripe, and we will save it in a Stripe enabled variable, but for now we are disregarding Stripe. We will get back to this when we implement Stripe payments, and we will do the same with the PayPal Smart Buttons. For now we sort of disregard this in our controller because we are interested only in Braintree. A Braintree variable is instantiated with an empty string, BT token variable with an empty string. This will be needed to start Braintree. I mean, obviously not the empty string, but if Braintree is enabled, we're going to save something else, a client token, into this variable. Now, there is also a Braintree label defined, credit card by Braintree. This is just a simple string. Let's check our checkout page. And the label here is credit card and PayPal by Braintree. So now we can pay with card, or we can pay with PayPal within Braintree. And because of that, we have this nice label that makes it obvious to the user that credit card and PayPal are both enabled here. But if we don't want to enable PayPal and we only have this card, this pay with card element here, then we want the text to say credit card by Braintree. All right, so Braintree is enabled now. We check if PayPal is enabled within Braintree. It is now, so this variable should contain the number 1. And if PayPal is enabled within Braintree, then we are changing our Braintree label to credit card and PayPal by Braintree, as you can see here on our checkout page. Let's get back to the checkout controller. Okay, so we have the BD settings, the Braintree settings, and I'm just fetching them. Let's check the Braintree settings table quickly. This is where we have our user details, so the sandbox merchant ID, the sandbox public key, and so on and so on. And this is where we choose if we are testing the application, so we are in the sandbox environment or in the production environment. Now here you cannot see my credentials. They are blurred out because I'm not comfortable sharing them, but you should see your credentials in your Braintree dashboard. So we have the Braintree settings. Obviously, if we don't find them, then it's a big problem and we are going to abort. Now, if the Braintree environment is sandbox, then we instantiate this great gateway variable, more like we are instantiating a Braintree gateway object. And then we are passing the value to these keys. So Braintree needs information about the environment, so we are passing the Braintree environment, which is sandbox now. Then we are passing the merchant ID, our Braintree sandbox merchant ID. We are passing our Braintree sandbox public key to the public key. And then for private key, we are passing our Braintree sandbox private key. These all come from our Braintree settings table. If our environment was not sandbox but production, then we would pass the production merchant ID, production public key, and production private key to our instantiated gateway object. And then when we have this gateway, so this gateway variable is loaded, then we take our BT token variable that used to be an empty string, and then we call client token, and then we call generate on our gateway object, and then we are going to get the BT client token based on which we can instantiate or load Braintree payments, as you can see here in the checkout page. Back to the checkout controller. So we have a Stripe public key, but I will just disregard this code for now, but when we implement Stripe, I'm coming back to these lines obviously. And now we hit the last line of code in our controller. We are returning the checkout view, so the checkout.plate.php file, and we are passing these variables to our checkout file. For example, the BT token, which will be absolutely necessary to be able to implement Braintree in our checkout. Let's check the checkout blade file now. The Braintree relevant sections, at least of the checkout blade file, because we already looked at this file earlier in the course. So this is the checkout blade file. The title of the page is checkout, and what we are interested in is the Braintree relevant sections. So we have a div for the payment methods. So this all payment methods container, and it's here. It is the div in which we load our accordions. Now we only enable Braintree, so this is the only accordion that we have for now. And if Braintree is enabled, then we have the accordion. So this is for the accordion. But what is interesting, what is very important, is that we have a totally empty div with the ID BT drop-in. This is the div in which the Braintree elements will be loaded into. So everything here is loaded into our BT drop-in div. And of course, this div is empty in the blade file, but the Braintree JS loads the Braintree elements into it. And we have a form that is going to submit to the Braintree payment route. This is a post form. Obviously, the method is post, and we add the CSRF token also to the form. And you see that there are some fields that we will post. However, these hidden fields are empty now, but in the JavaScript that we will use for the Braintree payments, we are going to load the necessary data into this form. And finally, we have a button, the click to complete purchase button, which will submit our form. This is the button here. And the last thing that is important for us for now is that if Braintree is enabled, then we are including the Braintree js.blade.php file. This is the file that contains the necessary JavaScript for Braintree to work. And this is the file that we created in our settings controller when we defined the Braintree settings. Let's just quickly check this file. Yeah, so this is the file ready for us to use. And of course, we see that it's working because Braintree is loaded onto the checkout. And there is another file containing JavaScript code that we will use for our checkout. This is the checkout.js.blade.php file here. And this will contain a lot of helper functions that we will use for our checkout, but we addressed this already. Finally, we have arrived to the heart of the Braintree integration. We are going to check out the Braintree js.blade.php file, and I will provide an overview of the file or how the Braintree payment works. And later, we are going to check the code line by line as well. The very first thing we do is that we include this Braintree JS. This is the official Braintree JS for the drop-in UI. So this is what we have to include in order to be able to load all these elements into our checkout page. Then again, inside the script tags, you're going to define our JavaScript or write our JavaScript. We define some variables first. So this basic form BT variable is going to include form data that will be needed for the validation before the payment. There is form Braintree variable, and we are getting the payment form BT form into this variable. So this is the ID of our form. And if we check the checkout blade file, then I'm searching for payment form BT. So this is the form that we will save into the variable. As you can see, it is the form from the previous video. So we are saving the form here. Now this form is empty, but don't worry, we are going to add data to it later. And we are instantiating a client token variable, and we are just giving the BT token PHP variable into this. Remember that in the checkout controller, we passed the BT token variable to our checkout view, so we have access to it in our Braintree.js file. Next, we have a BT instance variable, which contains an empty JavaScript object. Later, I will describe why we have this variable here, but for now, it's enough to know that it's an empty JavaScript object. And now the interesting part comes. So we have a Braintree object. Because we included the official Braintree script, we have access to this Braintree object, and we are calling drop-in and we are calling create on it. And this is the function that is going to create the drop-in into our application. So this is what is going to create this for our application. The authorization value should be the client token, so this BT token that we got in our checkout controller. The selector is the BT drop-in. So this is the empty div in which we are going to load all the Braintree elements. And in a checkout blade PHP file, I showed you that we have this empty div here with the ID BT drop-in. So for the selector, you just have to provide the ID of the empty div in which the elements have to be loaded. We have a data collector, or Braintree requires a data collector to be defined if we want to use 3D Secure and we want to use it. So we just have to define or instantiate an empty JavaScript object for the data collector. This is coming from the official Braintree documentation. And then there is the 3D Secure key, which we have to set to true, so 3D Secure check will be enabled for payments. Then we have the PayPal key, and for the PayPal key, we define flow vault, so this key value pair inside the curly braces. If you remember, in the template.js file, this is where we had the PayPal placeholder, and because we are using PayPal now in our application within Braintree, this placeholder was replaced with this string, and this is the line that will tell this create method that yes, please also load PayPal within Braintree because we want to enable PayPal payments as well. We are still in the create method. Notice that it ends only here, and one parameter that is passed into it is an anonymous function, and in this function we have the createAir and the instance variable. This is all coming from the Braintree documentation. You can check the GitHub repo now, but we will check it later as well. So in this createAir variable, so if this is true, if it returns true sort of, then there was a create error, then somehow the Braintree elements could not be loaded. It has never happened to me before, but it should be logged in the console that there was a create error, and we get the create error message. And then we return because the Braintree elements could not be loaded. However, this is not the case for us, fortunately, so we can just move forward. Now we have our form. So remember that we selected our empty payment form, and this button is part of that form. And we are adding an event listener to it, to the submit event, so when someone clicks on this complete purchase, then we don't want to submit an empty form, but of course we will have our application logic before we are submitting this form, and of course we will talk about more what happens when we submit a form and what we submit. But for now, what is interesting is that we have the event listener. So before the submit, we are preventing the default behavior. So, the form is not going to be submitted before all this code runs. We are defining the terms are checked variable, and we will get the return value from the check terms acceptance function. Now this check terms acceptance function is in our checkout.js file, so in the blade file where we have all these JavaScript helpers for us. And it should be, yes, check terms acceptance. So what we are doing is that we get this terms checkbox here on the checkout. And if it's not checked, then we are calling the show error and scroll up function with the following failure message, that the terms and conditions must be accepted before payment, before we try to pay, and then we return false. However, if the terms checkbox are checked, then we return true. And if we return true, then we can proceed with the BT drop-in creation, or with the BT logic. However, now I'm not going to check or uncheck this checkbox. We are just going through the code. So let's just assume that we passed this validation and then the terms checkbox are not false but true. Now we can proceed to the change fields after pay start function, which is also defined in our checkout.js. And what happens is that when we start a payment, then we are going to disable the information, so the user cannot change the information after trying to submit a payment. Earlier in the course we saw the example for it, and later, of course, when we are testing the Braintree payments, we will see how this function works, but it is quite straightforward because we are just disabling a bunch of fields here, and we are just removing error messages. Okay, so we are disabling the fields. Now, in this basic form BT empty variable, we're going to instantiate a new form data, and then we are going to append some data to this variable, and this will be needed for our validations before the payment is done. This helper is also in our checkout.js file, so we pass an empty form data here. Yes, this is the function, and we have an empty form as a parameter, and we are just appending the information here. So we are appending a underscore token field here, and this is the Laravel CSRF token for security purposes. We are getting the total value for the checkout. We are getting first name, last name, phone, street, and so on, and also the currency, the chosen currency, because it will be needed for our validations. So basically we are getting this data into this form data object. Let's get back to the JavaScript, to the Braintree JavaScript. Now into this BT instance variable, I instantiate an empty object, but I'm going to save this instance object from this anonymous function. And why I do it is because when we will start a payment, then we will need this object. And this is sort of, I think, cleaner to save it into a variable that can be used outside this create method or this anonymous function. But for now, I don't want to talk more about it, but later when we will check the payment line to line, line by line, then you will see why I have this BT instance object here and why I not only use this instance object that I get back in the anonymous function. Now essentially they are the same things, so don't get me wrong, but I will be able to use this BT instance variable in a much more flexible way than I could use this instance, than this object named instance here. And on line 30, we are hitting validate data. So this is a function which is not defined in the checkout.js. It's defined right below our create method, and this is where we will validate the payment data, and if the validation is successful, we are going to complete the Braintree payment, and we will use this function here. However, we will check these functions line by line. Now we are going to look at how we are validating the prepayment data. So we have our checkout form, and I'm filling in this dummy info, so first name, last name, and so on and so on. And before we want to submit our payment, we have to make sure that the customer provides all the data that we need. We looked at how Braintree is loaded into our checkout form, and we also mentioned that we have a validate data function, which we will use to validate the data, obviously. And we are going to look at this function, and we are going to look at the prepayment validation action of the checkout controller, where the data validation takes place. In this function, we are sending an AJAX request to the checkout validate course ID / course slug route. And this route should be here, yes. It is a post route, and the prepayment validation method of the checkout controller picks up this request for us, which is going to be here. So we pass the request object, the course ID, and the course slug to this method. Let's look at the Ajax request. So this is the URL. We are using Laravel's URL helper, and notice that we are in a blade file, so we can use these double curly braces, but we have to include the quotes around them. And so we can use Laravel's URL helper to get the base URL, and then we just have to define that we want to use the checkout/validate route, plus we have to concatenate the slashes and the other information that we need for the URL to be routed properly. Notice that we also use blade directives here. The request method is going to be post, as we could see in the web.php file. Then the data, so the data that we are posting is this basic form BT variable, which contains our loaded form data. You might remember what we are loading here, but let's check it again. So we are instantiating this variable to a new form data, and then we use the append basic data function and pass this empty form data to that function. And we are here in our checkout.js blade file where we append the basic data. So we append the token, the CSRF token. We are appending the total, the first name, last name, phone, street, apartment, city, country, state, zip, and also the currency to our form. Let's switch back to the Braintree JavaScript. So we are adding the form data, and then we have these two options here. By setting the process data to false, we are telling jQuery that we don't want the passed or the submitted data to be modified in any way. Now, I also set the content type to false, and here we really don't need this line because this would only be pertinent if we had files in our form, but we don't have any files. However, I use this Ajax function a lot, and when I copy paste this code, then I always put this content type false here in case I'm working with forms with a file in it. So we are sending our request, and two things can happen. Our request could be a success, or there could be an error. For example, we didn't define the correct URL, and then we would get an error, and we would hit this part of the code, and then we just use the show error and scroll up function, and we pass the unknown error during validation error message, and then we return. Actually, we don't need the terminal now, so I will just close it. Now, if we're lucky, then we are going to hit the success portion of the code. Hitting the success portion of the code doesn't mean that the validation was itself successful. What it means that the request was a success. So we got something back. If what we get back from the request has the successful validation property, then we can move on with the payment and complete the Braintree payment, because this means that the validation was successful. We're going to look at this in more detail a bit later. Now let's see the else branch. So if there were validation errors, then we are instantiating this field errors variable, and we are calling JSON stringify on the result that we got back from this URL or from this request. And then we are going to use the beautify JSON function to beautify our JSON, and then finally show it to our customers, and then we return. The beautify JSON function is also in the checkout.js file. Let me just quickly search for it. And it doesn't really do much, but we are globally replacing these braces and slashes and brackets in our JSON, and then we will also replace the period with a period and a line break. So if there are many validation errors, then our users will see the validation errors in a nice way at the top of the page. The next, we are going to finally look at the prepayment validation method of the checkout function, and hopefully we will return with a success. Let's look at the prepayment validations. We saw that the prepayment validation method of the checkout controller is going to take care of our request. As usual, we are making a validator object here, and we are validating everything in the request. Don't forget that what we get in our request object is the form data to which we appended the data. We are validating the first name and last name fields. These are the fields here, John and Ruth in our example. And these fields are obviously required. These have to be strings. They cannot be longer than 191 characters, so I doubt that there is any name in the world that is close to this length, so this is a good limitation for these fields. And then we have our custom validation, only ASCII characters. The only ASCII characters class is actually a rule that I created in Laravel, in this Laravel project, I mean. I'm using it here, so I'm importing it here. But let's check what it is doing. So I'm searching for it, and it is in the app rules directory, and we are here. If you want to create your own custom validation rule in Laravel, you can refer to the documentation, and this is what you need. This artisan command, PHP artisan make rule, uppercase. This is the example in the relevant documentation. When I created this rule, then obviously I used only ASCII characters instead of the uppercase word here. And then I got this nice file in my app rules directory. So we have the only ASCII characters class, and we have an empty constructor here. What we are interested in are the passes and the message function. So in the passes function, the value parameter is what comes from the request object. So the first name and the last name values. We are returning the result of calling the MB check encoding PHP function. The first parameter is the value, so what the user provided as a first name or as a last name, and the second parameter is what encoding we want to check against. So I want to make sure that there are only ASCII characters in the first name and in the last name fields. So if the value is ASCII encoded, contains only ASCII characters, then we pass the validation and we can move on with our further validations. However, if it fails and it has non-ASCII characters, then we are going to this message function, and the error message will be returned, which we will see on the front end after an unsuccessful validation attempt. Let's go back to our checkout controller. And before we move on to the further validations, I want to tell you why we need this custom validation rule. We have to use this custom validation rule because Braintree and Stripe both confirmed that in order to use the 3D Secure 2 workflow, then the first name and the last name fields should only contain ASCII characters. We are going to pass data from these fields to Braintree and Stripe while we are making payments. So it is very important that we have only ASCII characters. The Braintree documentation here on this link explicitly says that for the given name and surname, so basically our first name and last name fields, ASCII printable characters are required, else there will be a validation error. And we are in the 3D Secure section of the documentation, as you can see. Let's check now the other fields that we are validating. A street is required, it has to be a string, and it can be no longer than 191 characters. We could make this longer, but I doubt that there is any street that is longer than 191 characters. The apartment is nullable, so here there are addresses that don't require this apartment suite, unit, and so on information, so we make it nullable, and the customer doesn't have to provide information on it. Now, the phone is the same. We are making it nullable, but we are making it a simple string, and it cannot be longer than 191 characters. Now, for the phone validation, we could enforce other rules that we could enforce the specific number of digits, for example, for the phone number. However, in this demo application, we assume that this is going to be a global app, and we want the customer not to fail the phone validation if the customer is willing to provide a phone number for us. The city is also required, and it has to be a string, no longer than 191 characters as usual. And the zip code is also required, has to be a string, and it can be no longer 150 characters, but I think normally zip codes are like 5, 6, 7, 8 characters maybe, so this 150 is more than enough for our purposes. And of course I didn't forget about these two validations either. So the state and the country, these are our select tags. Now these are required, and actually these are also required for the 3D secure workflow. We are using strings, or we are validating against strings, sorry, and we have the exists validation rule. So the state that we get here has to exist in the states table under the state code column, and the country has to exist in the countries table in the code column. Let's just quickly go to the front end and check the country and state values. So if I press F12, then I will have the developer tools again, and let's inspect the element. So what we pass to our validator is the value here, not here exactly because this one should be for Afghanistan, but we are passing US because it is the selected value, United States of America, which should be here somewhere. It's here. So this is the value that we are going to pass to our validator, and this value, this US, has to exist in our countries table under the code column. Yep. And regarding the states, Wyoming is selected, the very last one. So this WI must exist in the states table in the state code column. Otherwise, the validation is going to fail. Now, if the validation fails, then we are going to return a JSON response with the validation errors. Let's have some fun and let's fail some validations. Now, the first validation that I'm going to fail will not be a validation of this form actually, but a validation of this terms checkbox. Let's look at the Braintree JavaScript, which should be here. Yep. You might remember that we have this check terms acceptance function, and if the terms checkbox is not checked, then we are returning and we show an error message. In the checkout.js file, we should find this function. Yeah, so if the terms checkbox is not checked before the user initiates a payment, then we show an error and scroll up and we return false. So let's check this validation first. I will not set the terms checkbox here, and I will use a dummy credit card data. So it can be 42424 times. For expiration date, it doesn't really matter what you put here, but it has to be in the future, and CVV doesn't matter either. Now let's try to complete the purchase. And yeah, we failed the validation. We failed the terms and conditions checkbox validation, and we received the following validation error. Now I'm going to check the checkbox, so we will not fail this validation. However, I will put a special character, or more like non-ASCII character, in the first name field. So we should fail the first name validation because of this umlaut A letter. I'm trying to initiate the payment again. And yeah, we failed the first name validation. First name and last name must contain only letter from the English alphabet, which should be familiar, I mean this message, because this is the message that our custom validation rule returns if there is a validation failure. So we specifically failed this validation this time. Now let's also fail the last name validation with this umlaut. And yeah, indeed, we failed the other validation as well. The message is the same in our demo application. However, we failed the first name field, and we also failed the validation for the last name field. Let's quickly check the process of failing a validation. So we fired the AJAX request with the form data, and the form data contained the first name and last name fields with these umlaut characters. And in our checkout controller, we failed the only ASCII characters validations for these two fields. So this validator fails, return true, and because of this, we returned a JSON with the validation errors. So we are going back to our Braintree.js, and the AJAX request itself was a success. However, we didn't get the successful validation key as a response, but we got our JSON failure response that we first stringify. And when we stringify this response or this result variable contains the error messages in JSON format, then we still have the brackets and the curly braces and all kinds of things that the JSON format contains. And this is why we use this beautify JSON function. We call this function on the field errors variable, so we can show multiple validation failure in a nice way on the top of the checkout page. Let's not provide a city, and let's not provide a zip code, and let's fail another validation. Okay, everything seems to work perfectly fine. Next, we are going to pass the validations, and we are going to see how the payment is processed. And now it's time to pass a validation. However, there are some other validation rules that I have in place for security, and we will discuss them first. Let's get back to our checkout controller. This is the Braintree.js. This is what I need. All right, so if we are failing the validation, then we return the JSON response. This is what we saw in the previous video. And here we can fail a few other validations. I'm not going to fail any of these validations now because these are only for security reasons, and we should really never ever fail these validations. So we have this course to buy variable, and what we want is to fetch the course from the courses table which the user wants to buy based on the course ID that was passed into the request. Now if we don't find the course, then we return a JSON response error, the course does not exist, but it should never really happen. However, if we find a course, we want to be super safe, and we also check if the slug of the course is the same as the slug that came from the request, this course slug variable. If they are not, then something fishy happened, and we are going to return an error response, discrepancy in course data. We have a final check before we can return successfully, and this is the course price. So we check the price of the course that the user wants to buy, and we check if the total amount, so the price of the course that was sent through the request, are the same. If not, we are going to return with an error, price discrepancy. If you remember, in the checkout blade, we have an element with the ID total, and we have a custom data attribute where we saved the total value. It should be somewhere here. So let's press F12 to get the Chrome developer tools, and let's inspect our element here. And yeah, this is it. So when we load the page, then in this data total custom attribute, we pass on the price of the current course. And when we append the data to our form data in the checkout.js file, and you see that we give the total key and we get this data total attribute from our element with the ID of total. So in the request, we can get it by using the total key. And if this value here is not the same as the value in our database, then it's a problem. Someone did something fishy and we return with an error. However, if everything is fine, so if we pass these validations and there are no problems in these if branches, then we are going to return a JSON response with the key successful validation, and with the value success. Let's go to our Braintree.js then. So if the returned result, which is our JSON, has the successful validation key, this is what this hasOwnProperty function tells us, then we will proceed to the complete Braintree payment function here. So now we will not fail the validation. However, I don't want the whole payment flow to finish, so I will add an alert here that we are in the complete Braintree payment function, and we are going to return without finishing the payment. So we just want to make sure that once the validations are passed, then we call this function successfully. Let's finally succeed our validation. So let me close this. I want to refresh. I will fill in the dummy info. I accept the terms. Then I want to use the Braintree card payment. Here is the test card. And what we expect now, that we will see an alert at the top of the page after I click to complete purchase. Yeah, indeed, in the complete Braintree payment function, and we returned. Don't think about this spinner now and the disabled fields. We sort of broke our own process, but it is intentional, so it is fine. In the next video, we are going to proceed with how Braintree payments work.